Karoline Leavitt loved her home. It wasn't anything fancy, just a cozy little house with a small backyard and a pool that she had saved up for years to install. That pool was her pride and joy, the one place where she could unwind after long days at work. She'd spent weekends planting flowers around it, adding string lights for evenings and making sure everything felt just right. To her, it wasn't just a pool, it was her sanctuary. One summer afternoon, Karoline was inside baking cookies when she glanced out the kitchen window. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. There, lounging by her pool like she owned the place, was her neighbor, a woman everyone in the neighborhood called Liberal Karen. Karen was known for being outspoken about social issues, always ready with an opinion on politics or community matters. But today, she wasn't talking about policy changes or equality. Today, she was sprawled out on a beach chair, sipping iced tea and soaking up the sun in Karoline's backyard. Karoline blinked, thinking maybe she'd imagined it. Nope. Karen was still there. Her bright pink swimsuit clashed horribly with the peaceful greenery of Karoline's garden, and her oversized sunglasses made her look like some kind of movie star who'd wandered onto the wrong set. The audacity of it all left Karoline speechless for a moment. How did Karen even get into her yard? The gate was locked, or so she thought. Taking a deep breath, Karoline stepped outside. She didn't want to start a scene, but this was her property, and she needed to say something. Walking over to the pool area, she cleared her throat. Hi, she said, trying to sound calm. I don't mean to interrupt, but what are you doing here? Karen barely moved. She adjusted her sunglasses and gave Karoline a lazy glance. Oh, hey, she replied, as if they were meeting at a coffee shop instead of Karoline's private backyard. Nice day for a swim, huh? Karoline crossed her arms. Yeah, it is, but this is my pool and I don't remember inviting you over. That got Karen's attention. She sat up slightly, though she still looked completely unbothered. Come on, relax, she said with a dismissive wave. We're neighbors. It's not like your pool is doing anyone any good just sitting here unused. Besides, sharing is caring, right? Karoline couldn't believe what she was hearing. Sharing? Sure, she believed in being neighborly, but this wasn't about borrowing a cup of sugar. It was about basic respect. I appreciate the sentiment, she said, keeping her voice steady. But this is private property. If you wanted to use the pool, you could have asked. Karen rolled her eyes dramatically, like Karoline was making a huge fuss over nothing. You're so uptight, she muttered. Fine, whatever, I'll leave. She grabbed her towel and stood up, brushing past Karoline without another word. But as she walked away, Karen tossed one last comment over her shoulder. Honestly, you should be grateful someone's using your pool. Most people would love having a neighbor like me. Karoline stood there, stunned. Grateful? For what? Having her space invaded. Without permission? She shook her head and went back inside, feeling frustrated and disrespected. This wasn't the first time Karen had pushed boundaries, but it was definitely the most blatant. Something had to change. Later that evening, Karoline vented to her best friend Lisa while they sat on the couch drinking wine. Can you believe her? Karoline asked, throwing her hands up. She just waltzed into my backyard like it was no big deal. Lisa nodded sympathetically. She's always been like that, though. Remember when she parked her car in your driveway for 3 days because it was closer to the street? Or when she borrowed your lawnmower and didn't return it for weeks? Karoline groaned. Exactly. I keep letting it slide because I don't want to cause drama, but enough is enough. She treats everyone like we owe her something. Lisa leaned forward, her expression serious. You've got to stand up for yourself. People like her only stop when they realize they can't walk all over you anymore. The idea lingered in Karoline's mind long after Lisa left. Standing up to Karen wouldn't be easy. She was loud, stubborn, and never backed down from an argument. But Lisa was right. If Karoline didn't do something, Karen would keep taking advantage of her kindness. And honestly, Karoline was tired of feeling powerless in her own home. As she drifted off to sleep that night, a plan began forming in her head. It wasn't malicious, just clever enough to make Karen think twice about crossing boundaries again. After all, sometimes the best way to teach someone a lesson was to give them exactly what they deserved. The next morning, Karoline woke up with a newfound determination. She wasn't going to let Karen's behavior slide anymore. But instead of confronting her directly or causing a scene, she decided to take a different approach, one that would make Karen realize the importance of respecting boundaries without escalating into an ugly feud. Karoline started by observing Karen's habits over the next few days. It didn't take long to notice patterns. Karen seemed to think the entire neighborhood belonged to her, borrowing tools from other neighbors' sheds, parking wherever she pleased, and even hosting impromptu gatherings in shared spaces like the community garden. Each time she justified her actions with vague statements about community spirit or sharing resources. To Karen, it probably sounded noble, but to everyone else it came off as entitled. One afternoon, while watering her plants, Karoline saw Karen walking down the street carrying a stack of flyers. Curious, she stepped outside to see what they were about. Sure enough, Karen stopped at every mailbox along the way, dropping off colorful pieces of paper advertising some kind of event, a town hall meeting titled, "Building a Better Neighborhood Together." The flyer promised discussions on collective responsibility, equitable resource distribution, and inclusive living practices. Karoline couldn't help but laugh when she read it. This was classic Karen, always talking about big ideas but rarely considering how her actions affected others. Still, the flyer gave Karoline an idea. If Karen loved organizing events so much, maybe it was time to throw one of her own. That evening, Karoline sat at her kitchen table with a pen and notepad, brainstorming ways to send Karen a clear message. She wanted something clever yet harmless, something that would embarrass Karen just enough to make her rethink her behavior, but wouldn't cross any lines. After a few hours of thinking, she finally landed on the perfect plan. She designed her own set of flyers using bright colors and bold fonts to grab attention. The headline read, "Liberal Neighbor Appreciation Day." Below it, she wrote details about a special gathering at her house, complete with free snacks, drinks, and games, by the pool. The description emphasized how important it was for neighbors to come together and celebrate their differences. On the surface, it sounded warm and inviting, but there was a twist. At the bottom of the flyer, in smaller print, Karoline added, "A note. This event is dedicated to teaching our most enthusiastic neighbor the true meaning of respect and boundaries. Bring your sense of humor." Over the next couple of days, Karoline distributed the flyers around the neighborhood. She slipped them into mailboxes, pinned them to bulletin boards, and handed them out to passers-by. When Karen spotted one tacked to the community bulletin board, she grinned widely, clearly assuming it was another opportunity to share her views with the world. Without hesitation, she marked the date on her calendar. As the day of the event approached, Karoline worked tirelessly to prepare. She cleaned up the backyard, set up chairs and tables, and stocked up on snacks and drinks. She also invited a few trusted neighbors who knew about her plan and agreed to play along. They weren't trying to humiliate Karen. They just wanted her to understand the impact of her actions. On the morning of the event, Karoline woke up early and double-checked everything. By noon, people began arriving, many bringing dishes to share or curious smiles. Some had misunderstood the flyer and thought it was a regular neighborhood party, while others had caught on to Karoline's plan and were eager to see how things unfolded. By 2 p.m., Karen arrived looking confident and ready to hold court. She wore a flowing sundress and carried a tote bag filled with pamphlets about various social causes. As she walked through the gate, however, she froze. Something felt off. Instead of the usual friendly chatter, the backyard was eerily quiet. Neighbors stood in clusters, whispering among themselves and casting sideways glances at Karen. Then she noticed the signs scattered throughout the yard. Handwritten posters with messages like "Respect private property" and "Boundaries matter too" hung from trees and fences. One particularly bold sign read, "No more freeloaders." Karen's face turned red as she realized what was happening. Before she could say anything, Karoline appeared, holding a tray of lemonade. With a sweet smile, she handed Karen a glass and said, "Welcome. So glad you could join us today." Karen forced a laugh, though it sounded more like a nervous squeak. "What's all this?" she asked, gesturing toward the signs. "Oh, just a little reminder about being considerate," Karoline replied cheerfully. "You know, sharing is great and all, but only when both parties agree. Otherwise, it's called trespassing." For once, Karen was speechless. She looked around at the crowd, hoping someone would jump in to defend her, but no one did. Instead, they nodded approvingly, silently agreeing with Karoline's point. Even worse, several neighbors pulled out their phones to snap photos, clearly planning to document the moment for future laughs. As the afternoon went on, Karen tried to salvage the situation by handing out her pamphlets and striking up conversations. But every attempt fell flat. People either ignored her or made subtle jokes about her past behavior. At one point, someone brought up the infamous pool incident, causing the entire group to burst into laughter. Karen's cheeks burned with embarrassment. Finally, unable to take it anymore, she grabbed her bag and muttered something about having other plans. Without saying goodbye, she hurried out of the yard, leaving behind a trail of awkward silence. Once she was gone, the mood shifted. Neighbors clapped and cheered, congratulating Karoline for finally standing up to Karen. Later that night, as Karoline cleaned up the remnants of the party, she felt a mix of relief and pride. For months, Karen's antics had been a source of frustration, but now the tables had turned. The event hadn't been mean-spirited. It was simply a light-hearted way of reminding Karen that respect works both ways. Still, Karoline knew this wasn't the end. Teaching someone a lesson was one thing, changing their behavior was another. As she turned off the backyard lights and headed inside, she hoped Karen would take the hint and start treating her neighbors with the consideration they deserved. Only time would tell if Karen had truly learned her lesson, or if more creative measures would be needed. The days following the Liberal Neighbor Appreciation Day were quieter than usual in Karoline's neighborhood. Karen, who had always been quick to pop up uninvited or make her opinions known, suddenly became a ghost. She avoided eye contact, during chance encounters hurried past Karoline's house without stopping, and even skipped the next community meeting. A first for someone who prided herself on being the voice of progress. At first, Karoline wasn't sure how to feel about this sudden silence. Part of her was relieved. Finally, she could enjoy her backyard without worrying about unexpected visitors or borrowed tools that never came back. But another part of her wondered if she'd gone too far. Had the event humiliated Karen so much that she'd withdrawn completely? Was that really the outcome Karoline wanted? She decided to give it some time. After all, Karen had left the party red-faced and embarrassed, but maybe that was exactly what she needed, a wake-up call wrapped in a little public shaming. If Karen truly understood why boundaries mattered, then perhaps the lesson would stick. And if not, well, Karoline would cross that bridge when she came to it. A week later, Karoline ran into Lisa at the local coffee shop. They grabbed their usual drinks and found a quiet corner to catch up. Lisa wasted no time diving into the topic they both knew was on Karoline's mind. "So," she said with a sly grin, "how's life after Operation Teach Karen a Lesson?" Karoline chuckled, stirring her latte. "It's been peaceful, actually. I haven't seen much of her lately. She's keeping to herself, which is kind of nice." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Do you think she got the message?" "I hope so," Karoline replied thoughtfully. "I didn't want to crush her spirit or anything. I just wanted her to realize that respect goes both ways. You can't preach about fairness while trampling over other people's rights." Lisa nodded. "Fair enough. But are you worried she might retaliate somehow? People like that don't usually take things lying down." Karoline shrugged. "Honestly, I've thought about it, but what can she really do? Start a petition against me? Organize a protest in my driveway? At this point, I'm not losing sleep over it. If anything, she'll probably try to win everyone back by being extra sweet." As it turned out, Lisa was right, but not in the way either of them expected. One Saturday morning, as Karoline watered her garden, she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. Turning her head, she saw Karen walking toward her, holding something in her hands. For a brief moment, panic flashed through Karoline's mind. Was Karen here to confront her, to accuse her of sabotage, or worse, to demand an apology? But as Karen approached, Karoline realized she looked different. There was no smug smile, no air of superiority. Instead, Karen seemed hesitant, almost nervous. In her arms, she carried a plate covered with aluminum foil. "Hey," Karen said softly, stopping a few feet away. "Can we talk for a minute?" Karoline set down her watering can and wiped her hands on her jeans. "Sure. What's up?" Karen hesitated before extending the plate toward her. "I baked these brownies. Figured I owed you something after everything that happened." Her voice wavered slightly, betraying a vulnerability Karoline hadn't seen before. Curious, Karoline took the plate and lifted the foil. Sure enough, there were freshly baked chocolate brownies underneath, still warm from the oven. "Thanks," she said cautiously. "But why now?" Karen sighed, shifting uncomfortably. "Look, I know I messed up. I've been thinking a lot about what happened at your, Appreciation Day thing. It wasn't fun for me, obviously, but it made me see how I've been acting. I thought I was helping people, showing them how to share and care about each other, but I guess I crossed a line. A lot of lines, actually." Karoline listened silently, unsure where this was going. This was a side of Karen she hadn't encountered before. Humble, reflective, and maybe even sincere. "I'm sorry," Karen continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "For barging into your space, for taking things without asking, for making you feel disrespected. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, I get carried away sometimes." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Finally, Karoline broke the silence. "Apology accepted," she said simply. "But actions speak louder than words. If you're serious about changing, show me, and everyone else, that you mean it." Karen nodded eagerly. "I will. I promise." Over the next few weeks, Karen kept her word. She started small, returning borrowed items promptly and asking permission before using shared spaces. When she hosted her next community event, she made sure to include input from others instead of dominating the conversation. Slowly but surely, her relationships with her neighbors began to improve, including her relationship with Karoline. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Karoline found herself sitting by the pool with Karen. They weren't close friends, but they were talking more openly than ever before. Karen admitted that she'd always struggled with balance, wanting to help others but forgetting to consider their feelings. Karoline shared how hard it had been to stand up to someone as outspoken as Karen, but also how empowering it felt to reclaim her space. As they laughed about the absurdity of the Appreciation Day event, Karoline realized something important. Standing up for herself hadn't just changed Karen. It had changed her too. She felt stronger, more confident, and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. And as the stars twinkled above, casting a soft glow over the backyard, Karoline smiled. Her sanctuary was hers again, and this time she knew exactly how to protect it. Weeks turned into months, and the neighborhood began to feel different. The tension that had once lingered in the air seemed to dissolve, replaced by a quieter kind of harmony. Karen's transformation wasn't overnight. There were still moments when her old habits threatened to creep back, but she was making an effort. And for Karoline, that made all the difference. One crisp autumn morning, Karoline woke up early to the sound of leaves crunching underfoot outside her window. She peeked out and saw Karen raking her own driveway, bundled up in a sweater and scarf. It was a small thing, but it struck Karoline as symbolic. For so long, Karen had acted like the world owed her something, expecting others to pick up the slack while she breezed through life. Now here she was, doing her part without complaint or fanfare. Karoline decided to seize the moment. She grabbed a mug of hot coffee, stepped outside, and walked over to Karen's yard. "Morning," she said with a smile, holding out the mug. "Thought you might need this?" Karen looked up, surprised but pleased. Oh, wow. Thanks. She accepted the coffee gratefully and took a sip. This is perfect timing. I've been meaning to clean up around here for days, but you know how it goes, always putting it off. Karoline chuckled. Yeah, tell me about it. My garden could use some work too. They stood there for a few minutes chatting casually about the weather and upcoming holidays. It wasn't anything deep or groundbreaking, but it felt good. Like two people finally meeting on equal ground. As they talked, Karoline noticed something else. Karen wasn't trying to dominate the conversation anymore. She listened when Karoline spoke, nodded thoughtfully, and even laughed at her jokes. It was a subtle shift, but one that spoke volumes. Later that week, Karen showed up at Karoline's door with an invitation of her own. Hey, she said, holding up a flyer. I'm hosting a little get-together next weekend. Nothing fancy. Just a casual potluck. I wanted to make sure you were invited. Karoline glanced at the flyer, which featured a simple design and a short list of instructions. Bring a dish to share, wear comfortable clothes, and leave any drama at home. It was a far cry from Karen's usual elaborate events, and Karoline appreciated the simplicity. Thanks, she said with a smile. I'll be there. Karen hesitated for a moment, then added, and, thanks again for everything. You know, for calling me out when I needed it. I think I'm finally starting to understand what real community means. Karoline nodded. We all have blind spots. What matters is that we're willing to learn. The potluck turned out to be a hit. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months found themselves laughing together over plates of homemade lasagna and apple pie. There were no speeches, no debates about politics or social issues, just good food, warm company, and the kind of easy camaraderie that comes from shared experiences. Even Lisa commented later that it felt like the start of something new, something better. As the evening wound down, Karoline found herself sitting by the fire pit with Karen and a few others. Someone brought up the infamous Appreciation Day event, and instead of cringing, Karen laughed along with everyone else. Yeah, okay, I deserved that, she admitted. But hey, it worked. Lesson learned. The group erupted into laughter, and Karoline felt a sense of closure wash over her. The whole ordeal, the pool incident, the awkward confrontations, the public shaming, had been messy and uncomfortable, but it had led to this moment. They weren't perfect neighbors, and they probably never would be, but they were learning to coexist, to respect each other's boundaries while still finding ways to connect. In the weeks that followed, Karoline noticed another change, not just in Karen, but in herself. Standing up to someone as bold and unapologetic as Karen had taught her the value of assertiveness. She no longer second-guessed herself when setting boundaries or speaking her mind. Whether it was at work, with friends, or even within her own family, Karoline carried that newfound confidence wherever she went. She also realized how much she'd underestimated the power of humor and creativity. The Appreciation Day event hadn't been malicious. It was lighthearted, clever, and ultimately effective. By turning a frustrating situation into something memorable and slightly ridiculous, Karoline had managed to send a message without resorting to anger or hostility. It reminded her that sometimes the best way to resolve conflict is to approach it with a mix of wit and grace. One chilly December evening, as the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, Karoline hosted her own gathering, a cozy holiday party for the neighbors. She decorated her backyard with twinkling lights, set up a hot cocoa station, and played soft music to keep the mood festive. Karen arrived early, bringing a tray of gingerbread cookies and offering to help with setup. You've come a long way, Karoline remarked as they arranged snacks on the table. So have you, Karen replied with a grin. You know, before all this, I never would have guessed you had such a mischievous side. Karoline laughed. Desperate times call for desperate measures. They shared a knowing look, both aware of how far they'd come since those tense summer days. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. As the night wore on, Karoline stepped back to take it all in, the laughter, the chatter, the glow of firelight reflecting off snowy branches. Her backyard, once a source of stress, now felt alive with warmth and connection. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was hers, and she knew exactly how to protect it. Standing there, surrounded by her neighbors, Karoline smiled. Life in the suburbs was messy, unpredictable, and full of challenges, but it was also beautiful. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to embrace every part of it. As winter gave way to spring, the neighborhood seemed to settle into a rhythm, a kind of quiet understanding that hadn't existed before. The frost melted, flowers began to bloom, and with them came a fresh sense of possibility. Karoline noticed it in small ways. Karen asking permission before borrowing tools, neighbors exchanging pleasantries instead of avoiding each other, and even impromptu gatherings that felt less like obligations and more like genuine connections. But life has a funny way of testing progress just when you think things are going smoothly. One sunny Saturday morning, as Karoline was planting new shrubs along her fence line, she heard raised voices coming from down the street. Curious, she wiped her hands on her jeans and wandered over to see what was happening. A group of neighbors had gathered near the community mailbox, their faces tense with frustration. At the center of the commotion stood none other than Karen, looking flustered but determined. She held a clipboard in one hand and gestured animatedly with the other as she explained something to the crowd. Whatever it was, not everyone seemed thrilled about it. Karoline hung back, observing quietly. Oh. A few moments later, Lisa joined her, arms crossed and eyebrows raised. Looks like trouble brewing again, Lisa muttered under her breath. What's going on? Karoline asked. Lisa sighed. Apparently, Karen wants to turn the empty lot at the end of the street into some kind of community garden. Sounds nice. In theory, right? But half the neighborhood thinks it'll be too much work or cost too much money. Karoline frowned. On the surface, the idea didn't sound bad. It could bring people together and beautify the area. But knowing Karen's history, she couldn't help but wonder if this was another case of good intentions gone awry. Still, she decided to give Karen the benefit of the doubt. After all, the woman had changed, or at least, she'd been trying. Later that afternoon, Karoline found herself sitting across from Karen at a local cafe. They'd agreed to meet so Karen could explain her plan in detail, hoping to win Karoline's support. Over steaming cups of tea, Karen laid out her vision: rows of vegetables, flower beds for pollinators, and benches where neighbors could sit and enjoy the space. It was ambitious, yes, but also thoughtful. I know I haven't always been great at, well, listening, Karen admitted, fidgeting with her spoon. But this time, I really want to do it right. I've talked to some experts, crunched the numbers, and figured out how we can make it happen without breaking the bank. All I need is for people to trust me, to give me a chance to show I've changed. Karoline studied her for a moment, weighing her words carefully. It's a big project, she said finally. And honestly, I think the idea itself is fantastic. But you know as well as I do that trust takes time to rebuild. If you want this to succeed, you'll have to prove it. Not just with words, but with actions. Karen nodded earnestly. I get that, and I'm willing to put in the work. I don't want to mess this up. Karoline smiled faintly. Then start small. Maybe focus on getting a few people on board first instead of trying to convince the whole neighborhood at once. Build momentum gradually, and let the results speak for themselves. True to her word, Karen took Karoline's advice. Instead of pushing for an immediate vote or demanding everyone's participation, she started by reaching out to a handful of neighbors individually. She listened to their concerns, adjusted her plans based on their feedback, and even rolled up her sleeves to help with smaller projects around the neighborhood. Things like fixing broken fences or organizing cleanup days. Slowly, but surely, skepticism began to fade. People saw that Karen wasn't just talking, she was doing. When she finally proposed the community garden idea again, this time with detailed blueprints and a realistic budget, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Even those who had initially opposed the project admitted they were impressed by her dedication. The groundbreaking ceremony for the garden took place on a warm spring afternoon. Neighbors of all ages showed up, armed with shovels, gloves, and excitement. Karoline stood beside Karen as they dug the first patch of soil together, laughing as dirt smudged their hands and faces. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt united, not because someone had forced them to cooperate, but because they genuinely wanted to. As the day wore on, Karen pulled Karoline aside. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "for believing in me, even when I didn't deserve it. I couldn't have done this without your guidance." Karoline shrugged modestly. "You did the hard part. All I did was remind you to slow down and listen." Karen grinned. "Well, maybe. But still, you helped me become someone worth trusting. That means a lot." In the months that followed, the community garden became a cornerstone of the neighborhood. Kids played among the flowers, families harvested fresh produce, and elderly residents sat on the benches, swapping stories and watching the world go by. It wasn't perfect. There were disagreements about watering schedules and debates over which plants to grow. But it worked because everyone contributed, including Karen. For Karoline, the garden symbolized more than just greenery and growth. It represented resilience, compromise, and the power of second chances. Watching Karen transform from a self-centered nuisance into a true team player had taught her an important lesson. People can change, but only if they're given the opportunity and the tools to do so. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Karoline sat on her back porch sipping iced tea and reflecting on everything that had happened. Her backyard, once a source of stress, now felt like a sanctuary again. The pool sparkled in the fading light, surrounded by blooming flowers and lush greenery. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear laughter drifting from the garden, a reminder of how far they'd all come. She thought about Karen, about the journey they'd shared, and about the unexpected bond they'd formed. Life in the suburbs wasn't always easy, but it was real. And sometimes that was enough. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Karoline leaned back in her chair and smiled. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she was ready to face them, with courage, humor, and a little help from her neighbors. Summer arrived, bringing with it long days filled with sunshine and the hum of cicadas in the trees. The community garden was thriving, a vibrant patchwork of colors and scents that drew neighbors together almost daily. Kids chased each other through the winding paths while adults chatted over baskets of freshly picked tomatoes and zucchini. It had become more than just a garden. It was a meeting place, a symbol of what could happen when people worked toward a common goal. Karoline found herself spending more time there too, not because she felt obligated, but because it brought her joy. She loved watching the transformation, not just of the land, but of the people tending to it. Karen, in particular, seemed to have found a new purpose. Gone was the entitled neighbor who thought rules didn't apply to her. In her place was someone who listened, collaborated, and genuinely cared about making things better for everyone. But as much as Karoline admired Karen's growth, she couldn't help but wonder if this newfound harmony would last. People were complicated, after all, and even the best intentions could unravel under pressure. Still, she chose to focus on the present, enjoying the peace while it lasted. One afternoon, as Karoline watered the herbs near the garden's entrance, she noticed Karen approaching with a clipboard tucked under her arm. Her expression was serious, which immediately caught Karoline's attention. "Hey," Karoline called out, setting down the watering can. "What's up?" Karen hesitated before speaking, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. "I need your advice, again." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "It's my sister," Karen admitted, sitting on a nearby bench. "She's moving here next month and I'm worried." "Worried? About what?" Karoline asked, joining her. Karen sighed, running a hand through her hair. Well, let's just say she's a lot like I used to be. Opinionated, stubborn, doesn't always think before she acts. I'm scared she'll cause trouble or worse, undo everything I've worked so hard to fix around here." Karoline nodded slowly, understanding the concern. "That's tough. Have you talked to her about it?" Not really, Karen replied. Every time I bring it up, she brushes me off, says I'm being dramatic or overthinking things, but I know how disruptive she can be. Trust me, living with her was challenging. Karoline chuckled softly. Sounds familiar. Karen managed a weak smile. Yeah, I guess karma's coming back to bite me, huh? It happens to the best of us, Karoline said reassuringly. But look at how far you've come. If anyone can handle this, it's you. Just remember what worked for you. Patience, communication, and maybe a little humor. Karen nodded thoughtfully. You're right. I just hope I can keep the neighborhood from falling apart all over again. When Karen's sister finally arrived, it didn't take long for tensions to rise. Unlike Karen, she didn't bother pretending to care about boundaries or respect. Within days, she'd borrowed tools without asking, parked haphazardly in shared driveways, and loudly criticized every aspect of the neighborhood, from the layout of the streets to the color of the community mailbox. Karoline watched as Karen struggled to manage the situation. At first, she tried reasoning with her sister, explaining how important it was to fit in and contribute, but when that failed, frustration bubbled to the surface. One evening, Karoline heard shouting coming from Karen's house, peering out her window. She saw Karen pacing on the front lawn, gesturing wildly as her sister leaned against the porch railing with a smirk. The next morning, Karen showed up at Karoline's door looking exhausted. I don't know what to do anymore, she confessed. She won't listen, and now half the neighborhood is complaining about her. I feel like I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place. Karoline invited her inside, offering a cup of coffee and a listening ear. As they sat at the kitchen table, she encouraged Karen to stay calm and patient. You can't control her behavior, Karoline said gently, but you can set clear expectations and stick to them. Let her know what's acceptable and what isn't, and don't back down no matter how uncomfortable it gets. Karen nodded, though doubt lingered in her eyes. Easier said than done. I know, Karoline replied, but you've got this. You've already proven you can stand up for yourself and others. This is just another challenge. Determined to take control of the situation, Karen decided to host a family dinner. A chance for her sister to meet the neighbors and hopefully start fresh. She invited everyone, including Karoline, who agreed to attend despite her reservations. The evening began awkwardly, with Karen's sister cracking sarcastic jokes and dominating the conversation. But as the night went on, something shifted. When dessert was served, one of the older neighbors stood up and thanked Karen for organizing the event. We've been through a lot as a community, he said warmly, and I'm proud of how far we've come. To Karen for turning things around, and to all of us for sticking together. The room erupted into applause, and for the first time, Karen's sister looked genuinely surprised. Afterward, she pulled Karen aside and muttered, "Okay, fine. Maybe these people aren't as bad as I thought." It wasn't a full-blown apology, but it was progress. Over the following weeks, Karen continued working with her sister, teaching her the importance of respect and compromise. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of bumps along the way, but eventually, the tension eased. By late summer, the neighborhood felt stronger than ever. The garden flourished, the air buzzed with laughter, and even Karen's sister began pitching in, albeit reluctantly. For Karoline, it was proof that change was possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances. As she sat by her pool one evening, watching fireflies dance in the twilight, Karoline reflected on everything she'd learned. Standing up for herself hadn't just changed her relationship with Karen, it had changed her entire outlook on life. She realized that conflict, while uncomfortable, could lead to growth, if handled with care and creativity. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but Karoline knew one thing for certain. She was ready to face whatever came next, with courage, humor, and the support of her community. As autumn rolled around, the neighborhood began to settle into a comfortable rhythm. The community garden, once a distant dream, was now thriving, a testament to what could happen when people worked together. But more than the plants and flowers, It was the relationships that had grown alongside them that truly mattered. Neighbors who had once barely spoken were now sharing meals, lending tools, and even planning weekend get-togethers. Karoline found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that tense summer when Karen first invaded her backyard. Back then, she'd felt powerless, frustrated, and unsure of how to handle the situation. Now she felt stronger, not just because she'd stood up for herself, but because she'd learned the value of patience, creativity, and forgiveness. 1. Crisp October morning, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze, Karoline decided to host a small gathering at her house. She invited a few close neighbors, including Karen and her sister, who had finally started fitting in. It wasn't anything fancy, just coffee, pastries, and good conversation, but it was a chance to celebrate how far they'd all come. Karen arrived early, carrying a tray of homemade muffins. "Figured I'd contribute something," she said with a sheepish smile. "Thanks for having us." Karoline laughed. "You're welcome, and thanks for these. They smell amazing." As they arranged snacks on the table, Karen hesitated before speaking. "You know, I've been thinking a lot lately about everything that's happened. I don't think I ever properly thanked you for not giving up on me, even when I made it hard." Karoline waved her off. "You don't have to thank me. You did the hard work. All I did was nudge you in the right direction." "Still," Karen insisted, "I wouldn't be where I am today if it weren't for you. That appreciation day thing, yeah, it stung, but it woke me up. Made me realize I needed to change, not just for myself, but for everyone around me." Karoline smiled softly. "Sometimes we all need a wake-up call. The important part is what we do after." The gathering turned out to be exactly what everyone needed, a reminder of how far they'd come and how much they'd accomplished together. As they sat around the fire pit sipping cider, stories flowed freely. Someone brought up the infamous pool incident, causing the group to erupt into laughter. Even Karen joined in, shaking her head at her own audacity. "I can't believe I thought your pool was fair game," she admitted, still chuckling. "What was I thinking?" "You weren't," Lisa quipped, earning another round of laughs. But beneath the humor was a deeper truth. They had all grown. Karen had learned humility and respect, while Karoline had discovered her own strength and resilience. Together, they had built something stronger than any one of them could have achieved alone. Later that night, as the guests began to leave, Karen lingered behind. "Hey," she said quietly, pulling Karoline aside. "There's one more thing I wanted to say." "What's that?" Karoline asked. Karen hesitated, then smiled. "You inspired me to keep going, to push harder, to be better, not just here, but everywhere. So, thank you. For everything." Karoline felt a lump rise in her throat. "That means a lot. Really." They shared a moment of quiet understanding before Karen headed home, leaving Karoline alone with her thoughts. Standing there under the stars, surrounded by the warmth of friendship and community, she realized something profound. Life wasn't about avoiding conflict or striving for perfection. It was about embracing the messiness, learning from mistakes, and finding beauty in the connections we create along the way. Over the next few weeks, Karoline noticed subtle changes in herself. She no longer dreaded difficult conversations or avoided standing up for what she believed in. Instead, she approached challenges with confidence, knowing that even the toughest situations could lead to growth, if handled with care and creativity. She also noticed something else. The neighborhood felt different. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements and misunderstandings, but there was a sense of trust and mutual respect that hadn't existed before. People looked out for each other, celebrated victories together, and supported one another through struggles. One chilly November evening, as Karoline bundled up to take a walk around the block, she stopped by the community garden. The plants had begun to wilt with the onset of winter, but the space still radiated warmth, thanks to the benches filled with chatting neighbors and the string lights twinkling overhead. She spotted Karen sitting by the fire pit with her sister, laughing over something silly. Watching them, Karoline felt a surge of pride, They weren't just neighbors anymore, they were friends. And though their journey had been rocky, it had brought them closer than anyone could have imagined. As she continued her walk, Karoline thought about the lessons she'd learned. Life in the suburbs wasn't always easy, but it was real. It was messy, unpredictable, and full of challenges. But it was also beautiful. Through every argument, every compromise, and every shared laugh, she had discovered the true meaning of community. When she returned home, she poured herself a cup of tea and stepped out onto her back porch. The pool shimmered in the moonlight, a reminder of where it all began. But instead of frustration or anger, Karoline felt gratitude for the sanctuary she'd fought to protect, for the friendships she'd forged, and for the strength she'd found within herself. As she gazed up at the starry sky, she whispered a silent promise to keep standing up for what she believed in, to keep building bridges instead of walls, and to never stop believing in the power of second chances. Because in the end, it wasn't just about pools or gardens or boundaries. It was about people and the endless possibilities that came from choosing kindness, respect, and understanding, even in the face of adversity.